In 1953, California told a clean, simple story. 4 young firefighters were sent into a wildfire. The fire was strong. The heat was extreme. The men were lost. Officials used a phrase that ended all questions. Vaporized. No bodies recovered. No remains returned. No proof required. The public accepted it. Newspapers printed it. Families were expected to live with it. 4 empty coffins were lowered into the ground, while a city stood in silence, believing the danger came from nature, believing the fire was to blame, believing there was nothing left to find. That story stayed untouched for decades. Here's the problem. Fire doesn't work that way. Wildfires destroy homes, forests, and lives. But they do not erase people completely. Even in the worst burns, something remains. Bone, metal, evidence, traces that refuse to disappear. Yet in this case, officials claimed there was nothing. Not a fragment, not a trace. Just a clean ending wrapped in hero language. That should have raised alarms. It didn't. Because the lie was convenient, and because trusting uniforms feels safer than asking questions. If history can erase heroes, imagine what it hides next. Subscribe now, and if you won't, comment. Why knowing the truth doesn't matter to you. These men weren't reckless. They weren't inexperienced. They weren't strangers to danger. They were trained, trusted, accountable to each other. They also disappeared at the exact moment they discovered something powerful people could not afford to have exposed. That detail was quietly ignored. No federal review, no independent investigation, no serious challenge to the report. Just praise, plaques, and silence. That silence wasn't accidental. Grief changes when doubt creeps in. Mothers didn't mourn bodies, they mourned questions. Sisters didn't accept closure. They felt something was wrong. Fathers wondered why brave men would walk into a death trap without resistance. But doubt doesn't survive long when every authority insists nothing remains. Over time, doubt gets buried, and buried truths become history, until they don't. This story isn't about a fire, it's about what happens when honesty becomes dangerous. It's about how easily a system can decide who deserves protection and who can be erased without consequence. And it leads to a question no one wanted asked in 1953. Who wanted 4 firefighters gone badly enough to make the truth disappear? Because fires don't erase men. People do. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Station 42 wasn't famous. It didn't host ceremonies or ribbon cuttings. It sat where the city thinned out and the land dried, where brush fires crept close enough to smell before you saw smoke. The building was old, the lockers rattled. The beds groaned when men collapsed into them after long shifts. Nothing about the place suggested heroism. What made it matter were the men inside. Here, trust wasn't spoken. It was proven on ladders that shook, in rooms thick with heat, and in seconds where hesitation meant someone didn't come back out. 4 young firefighters learned that lesson together. Calder Boone moved through the station like someone counting exits. At 22, he had already seen how fast things went wrong when leaders stopped listening. He watched more than he talked. He remembered details others dismissed. Calder believed preparation wasn't fear, it was respect for danger. He cleaned tools twice. He checked routes again. When reports didn't add up, he noticed. Some called him cautious, others called him serious. But when alarms rang, Calder was the one already moving, already thinking ahead. Late at night, he stayed awake longer than the others, writing notes he never shared, thoughts about responsibility, about where loyalty ended and conscience began. Harlan Vick didn't say much, and nobody asked him to. At 25, he carried equipment like weight didn't apply to him. When others stumbled, Harlan stepped in without comment. He believed strength was quiet. Showy effort meant something had already gone wrong. Harlan trusted nature more than people. He understood wind, understood terrain, understood how fast conditions turned against you. When calls ended badly, Harlan didn't talk about it. He cleaned his gear and prepared for the next one. He believed you protected the people beside you, no questions asked. Wyatt Crowe treated engines like living things. He listened to them, adjusted them, fixed problems before they announced themselves. The department didn't always approve parts, so Wyatt made his own solutions. If a truck failed on a call, someone died. That was how he saw it. Wyatt trusted machines because machines didn't lie. They failed for reasons. They didn't hide mistakes behind authority. He talked about opening a repair shop someday, a place where things were fixed honestly, without shortcuts or excuses. Until then, he made sure Station 42 never rolled out unprepared. Beckett Hale was the youngest, and everyone knew it. He felt things sharply: joy, fear, doubt. When others shook things off, Beckett held on to them. He sketched in quiet moments: faces, streets, buildings before they changed. He believed drawing was proof that something had existed. Beckett asked questions people avoided, about repeat fires, about missing paperwork, about why certain areas always burned. He wanted to believe the department stood for honesty. When small things didn't line up, it bothered him deeply. Some called him sensitive. Others called him observant. Both were right. They didn't bond over speeches. They bonded over work. Calder planned. Harlan stabilized. Wyatt maintained. Beckett noticed. On calls, words were unnecessary. A look meant danger. A pause meant regroup. When one hesitated, the others adjusted without judgment. Mistakes were corrected quietly. Pride stayed out of the way. They trusted each other because they had to. Trust wasn't emotional. It was survival. Firehouse life in 1953 followed a steady rhythm. Meals shared at odd hours, boots left by beds, radios interrupting sleep without apology, stories repeated, jokes worn thin, silence respected. They knew who drank coffee too late and paid for it later, who prayed before calls, who stared at walls afterward. In 1953, California told a clean, simple story. 4 young firefighters were sent into a wildfire. The fire was strong. The heat was extreme. The men were lost. Officials used a phrase that ended all questions: vaporized. No bodies recovered. No remains returned. No proof required. The public accepted it. Newspapers printed it. Families were expected to live with it. 4 empty coffins were lowered into the ground, while a city stood in silence, believing the danger came from nature, believing the fire was to blame, believing there was nothing left to find. That story stayed untouched for decades. Here's the problem. Fire doesn't work that way. Wildfires destroy homes, forests, and lives. But they do not erase people completely. Even in the worst burns, something remains. Bone, metal, evidence, traces that refuse to disappear. Yet in this case, officials claimed there was nothing, not a fragment, not a trace, just a clean ending wrapped in hero language. That should have raised alarms. It didn't. Because the lie was convenient. and because trusting uniforms feels safer than asking questions. If history can erase heroes, imagine what it hides next. Subscribe now, and if you won't, comment why knowing the truth doesn't matter to you. These men weren't reckless, they weren't inexperienced, they weren't strangers to danger. They were trained, trusted, accountable to each other. They also disappeared at the exact moment they discovered something powerful people could not afford to have exposed. That detail was quietly ignored. No federal review, no independent investigation, no serious challenge to the report. Just praise, plaques, and silence. That silence wasn't accidental. Grief changes when doubt creeps in. Mothers didn't mourn bodies, they mourned questions. Sisters didn't accept closure, they felt something was wrong. Fathers wondered why brave men would walk into a death trap without resistance. But doubt doesn't survive long when every authority insists nothing remains. Over time, doubt gets buried. And buried truths become history until they don't. This story isn't about a fire. It's about what happens when honesty becomes dangerous. It's about how easily a system can decide who deserves protection and who can be erased without consequence. And it leads to a question no one wanted asked in 1953. Who wanted 4 firefighters gone badly enough to make the truth disappear? Because fires don't erase men. People do. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Station 42 wasn't famous. It didn't host ceremonies or ribbon cuttings. It sat where the city thinned out and the land dried, where brush fires crept close enough to smell before you saw smoke. The building was old. The lockers rattled. The beds groaned when men collapsed into them after long shifts. Nothing about the place suggested heroism. What made it matter were the men inside. Here, trust wasn't spoken, it was proven, on ladders that shook, in rooms thick with heat, and in seconds where hesitation meant someone didn't come back out. 4 young firefighters learned that lesson together. Calder Boone moved through the station like someone counting exits. At 22, he had already seen how fast things went wrong when leaders stopped listening. He watched more than he talked. He remembered details others dismissed. Calder believed preparation wasn't fear. It was respect for danger. He cleaned tools twice. He checked routes again. When reports didn't add up, he noticed. Some called him cautious, others called him serious. But when alarms rang, Calder was the one already moving, already thinking ahead. Late at night, he stayed awake longer than the others, writing notes he never shared. Thoughts about responsibility, about where loyalty ended and conscience began. Harlan Vick didn't say much, and nobody asked him to. At 25, he carried equipment like weight didn't apply to him. When others stumbled, Harlan stepped in without comment. He believed strength was quiet. Showy effort meant something had already gone wrong. Harlan trusted nature more than people. He understood wind, understood terrain, understood how fast conditions turned against you. When calls ended badly, Harlan didn't talk about it. He cleaned his gear and prepared for the next one. He believed you protected the people beside you. No questions asked. Wyatt Crowe treated engines like living things. He listened to them, adjusted them, fixed problems, before they announced themselves. The department didn't always approve parts, so Wyatt made his own solutions. If a truck failed on a call, someone died. That was how he saw it. Wyatt trusted machines because machines didn't lie. They failed for reasons. They didn't hide mistakes behind authority. He talked about opening a repair shop someday, a place where things were fixed honestly, without shortcuts or excuses. Until then, he made sure Station 42 never rolled out unprepared. Beckett Hale was the youngest, and everyone knew it. He felt things sharply. Joy, fear, doubt. When others shook things off, Beckett held on to them. He sketched in quiet moments. Faces, streets, buildings before they changed. He believed drawing was proof that something had existed. Beckett asked questions people avoided, about repeat fires, about missing paperwork, about why certain areas always burned. He wanted to believe the department stood for honesty. When small things didn't line up, it bothered him deeply. Some called him sensitive. Others called him observant. Both were right. They didn't bond over speeches. They bonded over work. Calder planned. Harlan stabilized. Wyatt maintained. Beckett noticed. On calls, words were unnecessary. A look meant danger. A pause meant regroup. When one hesitated, the others adjusted without judgment. Mistakes were corrected quietly. Pride stayed out of the way. They trusted each other because they had to. Trust wasn't emotional, it was survival. Firefighters were expected to show up when everything else failed. That expectation shaped how they lived. They trusted each other because trust was all they had. These 4 men didn't see themselves as special. They saw themselves as responsible. When something felt wrong, they didn't ignore it. When questions surfaced, they didn't laugh them off. They believed that wearing the uniform meant more than obedience. It meant protecting people, even when doing so was uncomfortable. That belief tied them together tighter than fear ever could. It also placed them directly in the path of men who valued silence more than lives. At Station 42, the days before everything changed felt ordinary. Laughter returned. Equipment stayed clean. The city slept while the men stayed ready. None of them knew how little time remained. None of them knew how dangerous honesty was about to become. They trusted each other with their lives. They had no idea how costly that trust would be. The order came down like any other. Clear the crawl space under Station 42. Old storage, forgotten junk. A job meant to fill time, not raise questions. The space smelled damp. Wood groaned when stepped on. Dust clung to skin and lungs. Wyatt worked the crowbar under a loose plank, expecting rotten nails. Instead, the board lifted with resistance. Something heavy slid forward and struck concrete with a dull thud that didn't belong to scrap. It was wrapped tight in oilcloth, sealed with care, hidden with intention. No one spoke. In a building full of noise, that silence said everything. Wyatt peeled back the oilcloth slowly. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, thick and worn, its cover darkened by years of hidden handling. The pages clung together, swollen but intact. This wasn't a logbook. This wasn't station paperwork. Beside it lay rolled blueprints tied with twine, housing tracks, roads, entire neighborhoods outlined with precision. Calder opened the ledger at random. Names filled the page, not firefighters, not suppliers, city officials, developers, insurance brokers. Each name followed by figures that dwarfed a firefighter's annual pay. Wyatt did the math in his head and felt sick. Beckett leaned closer to the blueprints, tracing a marked street with his finger. He stopped. "That's my aunt's block," he said quietly. No one corrected him. No one needed to. They didn't rush. Calder turned pages carefully, his expression tightening line by line. Dates repeated. Locations repeated. Fires that once seemed unfortunate now followed a pattern too precise to dismiss. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't oversight. It was planning. Harlan shifted closer to the doorway, listening for footsteps above them. His instincts screamed the same warning he felt on bad calls. Something here was wrong, and staying too long made it worse. Wyatt focused on the figures. The numbers weren't random. They lined up with land sales that followed each fire. Empty lots, quick purchases, fast rebuilds. Beckett stared at the blueprints, anger rising behind his eyes. These weren't rescue maps, they were instructions. Station 42 hadn't just been answering alarms, it had been clearing the way. And the people who signed these pages knew exactly what they were doing. Calder turned another page and froze. At the top of the entry was a name none of them expected to see written so casually. Chief Orson Riggs. Not mentioned once, not twice. His name appeared again and again, tied to approvals, payments, and special assignments. Notes in the margins referenced meetings held off the books, and orders passed quietly. The room felt smaller. Harlan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. So this goes all the way up, he said. Wyatt nodded. And nobody below him says no. Beckett clenched his jaw. This wasn't a few bad decisions by distant officials. This was leadership signing off on destruction while firefighters were sent in afterward to clean up the damage. Calder closed the ledger. At that moment, the danger became clear. This wasn't evidence you reported and walked away from. This was evidence that decided whether you kept breathing. No one suggested calling it in. The idea didn't need to be spoken to be dismissed. Local channels answered to the same names written in that book. Reporting it the wrong way wouldn't start an investigation, it would start a cleanup. Harlan said what all of them were thinking. If this goes back to the station, it comes back to us. Wyatt nodded. And it won't be paperwork they send. Beckett's hands shook, anger cutting through the fear. If we put it back and walk away, people lose homes. Some don't make it out. Calder weighed the silence. There was no path that ended clean. One option meant living with it. The other meant becoming a problem powerful men would want solved. Federal, Calder said finally. Outside the city. Outside everyone on those pages. They agreed without ceremony. They would wait for their next day off. They would take the evidence past the chain of command. Until then, they would keep breathing and keep quiet. Wyatt moved first. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the crawl space to the repair bench and grabbed a length of galvanized pipe. Thick, heavy, built to last. This wasn't improvisation. It was instinct. They wrapped the ledger and blueprints again, tighter this time. Oilcloth, tape. Care taken like this was fragile, because it was. Wyatt slid the bundle into the pipe and sealed it shut. Metal met metal. Final. Quiet. That buys us time, he said. Calder nodded, though none of them knew how much time that really meant. The pipe went into Wyatt's locker, buried behind tools no one else touched. If the station was searched, it wouldn't be obvious. If something happened to one of them, the others knew exactly where to look. No vows were made, no promises spoken. They all understood the same thing. From this moment on, the truth was no longer just information. It was a liability. and anyone who discovered they were carrying it would decide what to do with them next. They went back upstairs and finished the task like nothing had happened. Tools were returned. Dust was washed from hands. Jokes were forced and fell flat. Anyone watching would have seen 4 firefighters doing their jobs. Inside, everything had changed. Every footstep in the station sounded closer than before. Every voice carried a second meaning. Orders felt heavier, like they were being measured instead of followed. Calder caught himself watching the door during roll call. Harlan listened harder to radios than usual. Wyatt checked his locker twice before walking away. Beckett stopped drawing. They hadn't told anyone, but secrecy has a way of changing posture, tone, timing. The truth sat between them, unspoken, pressing down. They told themselves it was temporary. 1 day off, 1 meeting, 1 handover. They believed silence would protect them until then. They didn't know who had already noticed the shift. They didn't know the ledger had started a countdown. Change is hard to hide. Captain Finnegan noticed first. The lowered voices. The way Calder stopped asking questions aloud. The way Wyatt lingered near his locker longer than necessary. Men who carried secrets moved differently. During morning lineup, Finnegan's eyes rested on them a second too long. His smile stayed fixed while his gaze measured. Nothing was said, but something was recorded. By afternoon, tasks came down sharper, more specific. Orders to stay close. Orders to move together. Orders framed as routine. Routine doesn't come with surveillance. Beckett felt it most. He caught Finnegan watching him sketch, then looking away as if nothing had happened. The ledger sat hidden, silent, sealed. But the truth has weight, and weight leaves marks. Someone else had sensed it. Someone had begun asking quiet questions of their own. They believed waiting was the smart move. 1 day off, 1 clean handover, 1 chance to pass the evidence to someone who couldn't be silenced by local pressure. That belief kept them steady. What they didn't realize was this. The moment they chose to wait, the clock started moving against them. People named in that ledger didn't survive by reacting slowly. They survived by removing problems early, before questions reached the wrong ears. And 4 firefighters with altered routines, guarded expressions, and sudden discretion were not subtle. By the time Calder suggested they move the pipe, it was already too late. Decisions had been made elsewhere. Orders had already been shaped. The ledger wasn't the only thing being tracked anymore. Station 42 was. And the men who benefited from fire had no intention of letting this end with a conversation. 2 days later, the wind changed, not just in the hills, but inside the station. Orders came down faster, movements were rushed. A sense of urgency crept in that didn't match the call logs. Captain Finnegan's tone shifted from casual to clipped, as if timing mattered more than safety. Calder noticed the radio channels assigned to their crew were oddly quiet. Wyatt saw unfamiliar hands near the equipment bay. Harlan caught Finnegan checking his watch twice during briefing. Beckett felt it in his chest. Pressure without explanation. They told themselves it was coincidence. It wasn't. Somewhere beyond Station 42, the ledger had stopped being a secret and started being a problem. And problems like that didn't get debated. They got removed. The next call would sound routine. The destination would look familiar. And the truth sealed in that pipe would never get its meeting. Not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Captain Miller, Huck Finnegan, had always been predictable. Loud laugh, heavy steps, orders delivered like habits, not commands. That changed after the crawl space. He stopped joking with them, stopped lingering during meals. His presence became sharper, more focused, like he was counting something no one else could see. During morning assembly, his eyes didn't scan the group anymore. They settled, one by one, Calder, Harlan, Wyatt, Beckett. Each pause lasted a fraction longer than comfort allowed. When Calder asked for clarification on a routine assignment, Finnegan didn't answer right away. He smiled instead. A thin, controlled smile that never reached his eyes. "Just do as you're told," he said. The words weren't new. The way he said them was. For the first time since joining Station 42, the crew felt it together. They weren't being led. They were being assessed. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. Wyatt's locker was open when he returned from a call. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. Just open, like a reminder. Harlan's transfer request stalled without explanation. Paperwork that used to move in hours now sat untouched for days. Beckett was reassigned mid-shift, pulled off routine checks and sent to inventory under Finnegan's watch. No reason given, no argument accepted. Calder noticed the logs changing. Arrival times rounded. Radio chatter summarized instead of recorded. Details softened until they barely resembled truth. Each incident on its own meant nothing. Together they formed a message. You are seen. You are noted. You are not in control. No threats were spoken. None were needed. Authority doesn't raise its voice when it knows it can tighten the room instead. And at Station 42, the room was getting smaller. Calder was the first to say it out loud. Not as an accusation, as an observation. Look at the assignments. He laid the duty sheets side by side. Different dates, same result. The four of them were paired together again. And again. Always the same routes, always the same zones. Harlan checked the call logs. Minor fires rerouted, backup units delayed. Response times adjusted just enough to isolate one crew without raising flags. Wyatt traced the radio traffic. Channels switched mid-shift. Dead air where confirmation should have been. Messages acknowledged late or not at all. This wasn't coincidence. This was planning disguised as routine. Someone had studied how Station 42 moved, how long it took for help to arrive, which calls pulled which units away. The realization landed heavy. They weren't being punished. They were being positioned. And once you see a pattern like that, there's only one question left to ask. Positioned for what? Finnegan didn't need to threaten them. He started showing up where he wasn't scheduled. Standing near the bays during shift changes, watching the crew load gear without speaking. Once, he followed Calder to the supply cage and closed the door behind them. Didn't lock it, didn't block the exit, just stood there. "You boys working on anything interesting?" he asked. Calder met his eyes and answered carefully. "Just our jobs." Finnegan nodded, satisfied, like he'd heard exactly what he wanted. When he left, the door stayed open. Another time, Wyatt found his locker number written in chalk near the watch desk. No initials, no message. Just a number that told him someone knew where to look. Beckett noticed unfamiliar men near the station fence after dark. Not firefighters, not city workers. Watching. Nothing happened. And that was the point. By the third day, the air itself felt wrong. Santa Ana winds began pushing through the hills, hot, dry, fast. The kind of wind that turned small sparks into races against time. Calder marked it on the board. Harlan adjusted equipment checks. Wyatt reinforced the engine load. Beckett stopped sketching entirely. Finnegan watched the forecasts more than the crew. Every briefing ended the same way now. Short. Focused. No discussion. The word "stay sharp" carried a second meaning that no one missed. Wind like this didn't just raise fire risk. It created cover. Sound disappeared faster. Smoke moved where it wasn't expected. Visibility failed without warning. If something went wrong out there, the terrain would decide how much anyone saw and how much anyone heard. The crew understood the math. The winds weren't the danger. They were the excuse. And excuses are useful when someone wants an outcome without witnesses. They started mapping exits without saying why. Calder traced canyon roads on scrap paper. Harlan checked which routes lost radio contact first. Wyatt counted minutes between call relays. Beckett noted where smoke pooled instead of lifting. It wasn't fear driving them. It was preparation. Finnegan noticed. He always did. During a late check, he stood beside the engine and tapped the side panel twice. Slow, measured. "Mountains don't forgive mistakes," he said. "Neither do fires." No one replied. Because the warning wasn't about mistakes. It was about isolation. Out there, distance lied. Help sounded closer than it was. And when radios failed, stories became whatever survived the heat. The crew exchanged looks they didn't need to explain. If something happened beyond those ridges, it wouldn't just be dangerous, it would be convenient. The call schedule stopped making sense. Small brush alerts were marked urgent. Known hotspots were ignored. Engines that should have been closest were quietly reassigned elsewhere. Calder checked the board twice. Harlan checked it a third time. "This puts us alone," Wyatt said, keeping his voice low. Beckett traced the route with his finger. One road in, one road out. Both narrow, both exposed. They brought it to Finnegan. He didn't look at the map, didn't ask questions. He approved it instantly. "That's the job," he said. "Sometimes you draw the short straw." Routine. That word again. But routine doesn't ignore safety math. Routine doesn't strand a crew during peak wind hours. Routine doesn't remove fallback options. This wasn't carelessness, it was design. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. The system they trusted wasn't failing, it was working exactly as someone intended. Calder asked the question no one wanted to answer. Who gains if we don't come back? They worked it like an investigation. Not emotions, incentives. Harlan listed the properties tied to recent fires. Ownership transfers rushed, prices low, buyers anonymous. Wyatt checked city permits approved faster than normal after burn zones cleared. Beckett remembered faces near the fence that didn't belong to the department. Patterns aligned. Isolation reduced witnesses. Wind erased sound. Fire destroyed records. Reports could be softened later. And Finnegan sat at the center of the schedule, the radios, the approvals. No proof yet. Just structure. Just access. That was enough to understand the risk. If they raised alarms now, they'd be accused of panic. If they waited, they'd be labeled careless if something went wrong. Silence boxed them in from both sides. Someone had engineered a situation where speaking looked reckless and disappearing looked like fate. That's when they knew the watch wasn't passive. It was active. There's a point in every investigation where denial stops being useful. This was theirs. Calder folded the maps and didn't put them away. He left them on the table, visible, deliberate. If someone walked in, they'd see planning, not confusion. Harlan stopped lowering his voice. If they were being monitored, whispers only helped the wrong people. Wyatt adjusted the engine load with extra restraints. Not regulation, not sloppy, defensive. Beckett wrote a letter and didn't seal it. He slid it into his locker, not hidden, just waiting. They didn't say goodbye. That would have been an admission. Instead, they treated every movement like it mattered. Every instruction like it could be their last normal one. The shift ended without incident. That was the warning. When pressure builds and nothing happens, it means someone is waiting for conditions to be perfect. The crew didn't ask if something was coming anymore. They asked when. The night before the call, no one slept well. Wind pressed against the station doors in uneven bursts. Loose metal clattered somewhere outside, then stopped, then started again. Radios hissed with static even when no one spoke. Finnegan stayed late. That alone was unusual. He made a point of walking past the crew, checking nothing, saying little. Once, he paused near the call board and ran his finger down the list of units, slow, like he was choosing. Calder caught the look. Not concern, not urgency, finality. By morning, the forecast worsened. Heat climbed. Gusts accelerated. Conditions lined up the way reports always warn about, and commanders quietly plan around. Except this time, the planning pointed inward. When the alarm finally sounded, it didn't feel sudden. It felt scheduled. The crew moved on instinct, but each of them understood the same thing as they rolled out of Station 42. This wasn't just a response. It was a test of whether anyone would come looking if they didn't return. The call came in just after noon. Brush fire, canyon edge, fast spread. Nothing about it sounded unusual until the details followed. Wind-driven, access limited, reports conflicting. One dispatcher said hikers, another said a trapped vehicle. The location shifted twice before the coordinates locked. Devil's Peak. Calder felt it tighten in his chest. That stretch of land was narrow, steep, and unforgiving. Fire moved faster there than radios could track. As Engine 17 rolled, smoke already climbed the ridgeline in uneven columns. Not one fire, several. Spot blazes breaking ahead of the main front, leaping ground the way only wind-fed heat could. Wyatt watched embers lift and travel sideways. Harlan checked the gauges more than once. Beckett stared at the map, then out the window, then back again. This wasn't a random burn, it was spreading with purpose. And the timing, midday, peak heat, full wind, felt less like bad luck and more like a calculated risk someone was willing to take. By the time they reached the lower switchbacks, the canyon was already loud. Wind tore through brush in sharp bursts. Flames ran uphill in quick, aggressive lines, cutting across paths that should have slowed them. Ash struck the windshield like grit. Radio traffic stacked on itself. Units talking over units. Coordinates corrected, and then corrected again. Someone mentioned hikers. Someone else mentioned screams. No names, no confirmation. Calder requested support. Static answered first. Then a pause. Then a calm voice cleared them to proceed alone until backup could reposition. Alone. Wyatt glanced at the ridgeline and shook his head. Fire had already crossed a break that was supposed to hold. That didn't happen by chance. Harlan watched the windsock whip hard enough to snap its line. Conditions were past caution, past standard. Beckett keyed the radio again. This time the reply came late and felt rehearsed. Engine 17, continue, possible rescue ahead. Possible, that word settled wrong, because out here guesses get people killed. And someone was guessing with their lives. The rescue call came through twice. First as a broken transmission, half a sentence, cut by wind. Then again, cleaner. Too clean. Possible civilians trapped near the upper trail. Calder slowed the engine. That trail had been closed for weeks. Erosion, no signage, no foot traffic. Anyone who worked this area knew that. Wyatt said it quietly. There shouldn't be anyone up there. The dispatcher confirmed the location without adding names, numbers, or descriptions. No movement reports, no callback contact. Harlan asked for verification. Silence followed. Then Finnegan's voice replaced the dispatcher. Proceed, he said. Lives first. The words were right. The timing wasn't. Beckett checked the map again. The route funneled them into a dead section. Rock walls on both sides. One narrow exit. Heavy brush above. Perfect for fire to race downhill. Perfect for sound to vanish. The crew exchanged looks that didn't need explanation. Rescue calls save lives. False ones decide whose life gets spent. And this one felt designed. They committed to the climb. The road narrowed fast. Brush pressed close enough to scrape paint. Heat pushed in waves, bending the air until distance lied. Visibility dropped without warning as smoke folded back on itself. Then the radio died. Not static, not interference. Silence. Wyatt tried the backup. Nothing. Harlan checked the antenna line twice. Intact. Power steady. Calder ordered a turnaround. The rear path was already gone. Fire had crossed behind them, sealing the road with fast-moving flame that chewed through dry ground like paper. No gradual spread. No warning buildup. Beckett watched embers rain sideways, carried with purpose, landing ahead of the engine instead of behind it. That's when it landed. This wasn't a rescue route, it was a funnel. Every choice made before this moment, delayed backup, false coordinates, quiet radios, had pushed them here. Not trapped by chance, but guided by decisions that looked official until they stacked together. Calder said it aloud, voice tight but controlled. We were sent in alone. And alone was exactly where someone wanted them. Finnegan's voice cut back in, thin and distant. Engine 17, status check. Calder reported the fire behavior honestly, too honest for comfort. Wind shifts, blocked exit, no visibility. He asked again for air support, again for ground units. The reply came measured. Calm. Wrong. Hold position, you're closest. Do what you can. Closest to what? There were no civilians, no confirmed victims, no reason to stay put while fireboxed them in. Wyatt stared at the ridgeline and saw figures where smoke thinned. Men not moving like firefighters. No gear, no urgency. Watching. Harlan felt it then. The drop in the stomach. The moment when training stops explaining outcomes. Beckett realized why the call had been framed the way it was. If they didn't come back, the story would be clean. Brave crew. Extreme conditions. No blame. Heroism makes a convenient explanation. It closes questions before they're asked. And as the flames climbed higher, the crew understood the final shape of the plan. They weren't meant to be rescued. They were meant to be remembered. Heat surged without warning, not a gradual rise. An onslaught. Air turned harsh, each breath scraping the throat. The engine's metal ticked and popped, as if stressed by something heavier than fire. Calder ordered a reposition to higher ground. The tires spun, then caught, then spun again. Loose rocks slid beneath them, carried downhill by gusts that refused to settle. Wyatt checked the fuel line and shook his head. Pressure dropping. Not failure. Strain. Harlan spotted movement again along the ridge, shapes crossing where fire should have forced retreat. No radios, no lights, just silhouettes pacing their progress. Beckett keyed the mic one more time. Still nothing. Then came the realization that cut deeper than the heat. No one was correcting the story forming back at the station. No one was redirecting units. No one was asking follow-up questions. Devil's Peak wasn't just closing in physically, it was closing the record. Whatever happened here would be written by people nowhere near the flames. And the crew finally understood what isolation really meant. The final confirmation came quietly. A second engine was dispatched, past their position, not toward it. Calder caught the call sign before the channel cut again. They weren't the priority. Wyatt slammed his glove against the dash. They know exactly where we are. Harlan did the math out loud. Wind speed, flame front, escape time. None of it worked, unless help arrived immediately. It wasn't coming. Beckett looked back down the road they'd entered from. Fire had erased it completely. No gap, no slowdown. Just a wall that advanced without hesitation. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't confusion. It was permission. Permission for the fire to finish what scheduling, silence, and misdirection had started. Permission for 4 men to be erased without fingerprints or witnesses. Calder took a breath and made the call that confirmed everything. Station 42 were being boxed. The response never came. And in that silence, the last doubt died. They hadn't been sent to fight a fire. They'd been sent to disappear inside one. Calder stopped issuing escape orders. That was the moment everything shifted. He gathered them close to the engine, voices raised just enough to cut through the wind. There was no panic in his tone, only clarity. "We document," he said. "We mark time. We make it hard to lie." Harlan pulled the logbook from the cab and started writing with bare hands, ash sticking to the paper. Times, directions, radio failures, names. Wyatt used a knife to scratch coordinates into the engine's side panel. Metal bit back, but the marks held. Beckett took off his helmet and set it carefully where it could be found. Inside, he left his badge. They weren't surrendering. They were resisting the story being prepared for them. If this ended here, someone would have to explain the details they left behind. Someone would have to smooth over facts that refused to disappear. The fire roared louder, angry at the delay. But the crew had already made their final decision. If they couldn't get out alive, they would not vanish quietly. The radio crackled once, not clear, not steady, but alive. Calder grabbed it before the signal could slip away. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. Every word mattered now. "Engine 17 to any unit," he said. "We were sent in alone. Coordinates rerouted. Exit blocked. This is not fire behavior." Static pushed back, thick and heavy. Wyatt leaned in. "Repeat that. Record this." Calder did. He named the road, the wind direction, the time the channel went silent. He named the order that kept them in place. No one answered. But they knew how this worked. Messages like this didn't disappear. They echoed. They got logged. They forced paperwork. They forced explanations. Beckett watched the flames climb the ridge and felt the heat push closer. Harlan closed the logbook and held it to his chest. The transmission cut mid-sentence. Not because the radio failed, because the fire surged again, loud enough to drown everything else out. And somewhere far away, a recorder captured the last proof that this wasn't an accident. When the fire finally consumed Devil's Peak, it did so completely. By the time other units reached the perimeter, there was nothing left to enter. Heat forced them back. Smoke erased depth. The ground shifted under boots like it was still alive. Command declared the area unrecoverable. The report came together quickly, too quickly. Extreme conditions. Sudden wind shift. No remains located. Equipment presumed destroyed. A tragic loss in the line of duty. Heroism sealed and stamped. No mention of rerouted calls, no mention of dead radios, no mention of the engine's last coordinates. 4 names were added to a memorial wall before questions had time to form. Station 42 mourned publicly. Families were handed folded flags and rehearsed explanations. The department moved on. But somewhere under that scorched earth, details survived the fire. Scratched metal, a buried logbook, a transmission that never made it into the final summary. The blaze had erased the men. It had not erased the truth. It only delayed it. They saw them through the smoke, not running, not retreating, standing where no one should stand. 4 figures emerged along the ridgeline, spaced apart, calm. No protective gear, no urgency. Their shapes cut clean against the glow of fire behind them. Wyatt froze. Those aren't firefighters. Calder knew it instantly. Fire teaches posture. These men didn't move like people afraid of heat. They moved like people on assignment. One of them raised an arm, a signal. Another stepped forward and brought something to his shoulder. Metal caught the firelight. Beckett felt the shift before the sound. Pressure, intent, finality. Harlan opened his mouth to speak. The first shot cracked, sharp and brief, then vanished into the roar of the blaze. No echo, no warning, just absence where a voice had been. Calder reached for the radio. Nothing. Above them, the men didn't rush. They waited. Fire hid everything that mattered, and someone had decided this was how it would end. Calder keyed the radio again. Station 42. Armed men on the ridge. We are under fire. The channel stayed open. No static, no interruption, no response. Wyatt fired a flare into the smoke, bright enough to cut through the chaos. It burned for seconds, then vanished, swallowed whole. Harlan dragged Beckett behind the engine as another shot tore through the air. It passed so close the sound arrived late, like the fire had eaten it first. Calder switched channels. Emergency command, mutual aid. Nothing. And then it hit them. The silence wasn't technical. It was deliberate. Finnegan had access to every channel they were using. He could hear them. He always could. But he wasn't cutting in. He wasn't correcting reports. He wasn't asking questions. Silence can be an answer when someone in charge has already chosen a side. The men on the ridge adjusted their positions. Slow, controlled. This wasn't panic. It was execution with permission. The second shot came faster, then a third. Each crack should have echoed. None did. The fire swallowed sound the way it swallowed light, folding noise into heat until direction meant nothing. Wyatt pulled Calder down as sparks tore across the engine's hood. Metal rang once, sharp, then dulled by flame. Harlan tried to count the spacing between shots. He stopped after 2. Timing didn't matter anymore. Beckett pressed his face into the dirt, ash coating his mouth, the taste bitter and thick. He heard footsteps above the ridge, measured, unhurried. No shouting, no commands. Professionals don't yell. A bullet struck the engine block and vanished into smoke. Another passed high, close enough to push air across skin. Calder raised his hands, not in surrender but to signal position. To be seen. No one acknowledged it. The men on the ridge weren't aiming to scare. They were aiming to finish. And the fire made sure no one beyond Devil's Peak would hear how it happened. Calder made the call one last time. Not for rescue, for record. He gave names, locations. The fact the gunfire was active inside a declared fire zone. He spoke clearly, slow enough to be logged. The channel stayed open. Still no reply. That was when the truth settled fully. Command wasn't confused. Command was present. And presence without action is a decision. Wyatt shouted toward the ridge. "This ends someone's life, you know that." No answer. Instead, one of the figures stepped closer, boots steady on burning ground. Another raised his weapon again. Harlan realized something colder than fear. These men weren't afraid of witnesses because the system above them had already agreed there would be none. Finnegan's silence wasn't absence. It was authorization. The next shot came lower, closer, and the fire surged hard enough to erase the moment between sound and consequence. The fire pressed in from both sides now. Heat pinned them low. Smoke stripped distance from everything. Shapes dissolved into motion and noise. Wyatt tried to move left. A shot cut dirt at his feet and forced him back. Deliberate. Controlled. A warning without words. Harlan dragged the logbook closer to the engine, shielding it with his body. He wasn't thinking about survival anymore. He was thinking about proof. Beckett crawled toward Calder, eyes stinging, breath shallow. "They're closing," he said. It wasn't panic. It was observation. Calder nodded once. There was no confusion left to clear up. No chance this was misread. No space for hope that someone would step in. The men on the ridge advanced in intervals, using flame and smoke like cover, timing each move with the wind. This wasn't chaos. It was procedure. And procedures like this only happen when the outcome has already been approved. The next shots came close enough to feel, not hear, feel. Air punched skin. Dirt jumped. Metal screamed once and went quiet. The engine took the hits meant for bodies, and the men behind it knew that wouldn't last. Wyatt looked at Calder and gave a short nod. No words, no fear left to manage. Harlan tore a page from the logbook and shoved it into his jacket, then another into Beckett's glove. Instinct over reason. A figure moved through smoke on the right. Too close now. Close enough for faces, though none could be seen. Calder stood. Not to run, not to beg, to force recognition. The shot came immediately, sharp, final, lost inside the fire before it could become sound. Calder dropped out of sight, and the men on the ridge didn't react. They just shifted position and continued forward, because the task wasn't done yet, and no one was coming to stop it. The fire surged as if on cue. Flames rolled over the engine, climbing fast, hungry, wiping edges from everything they touched. Smoke thickened until direction meant nothing at all. Wyatt felt heat tear through his jacket as another shot cracked past. Too close to count as luck. He dropped, dragging Beckett with him, both of them coughing, eyes burning. Harlan stayed where he was. He pressed the logbook under the engine frame, wedging it deep, shoving ash and dirt over it with bare hands until his skin blistered. Pain didn't register. Purpose did. Another shot, then another. Fire roared louder, louder than commands, louder than proof, louder than men trying to leave something behind. The figures on the ridge began to fade, retreating not from danger but from completion. Their work was nearly finished. As the heat climbed past endurance, the fire did what it had been chosen to do. It consumed what remained, and it destroyed anything that could still speak back, except what had already been hidden. The gunfire stopped first, not because it wasn't needed, but because it was finished. Fire took over completely, folding inward, collapsing space, crushing sound into a single, endless roar. Shapes vanished, edges disappeared. The world reduced itself to heat and pressure. Wyatt lost track of time. Seconds stretched, then broke apart. He felt Beckett go still beside him. Harlan was no longer shouting. Calder was already gone. There were no final words, no speeches, no heroic last stand anyone would repeat later. Just endurance pushed past its limit. The men on the ridge withdrew without urgency. No running, no celebration. They moved the way people do when a job ends exactly as planned. Above it all, smoke rose clean and tall, carrying nothing that could identify what had really happened. By the time the fire reached its peak, there was no one left to witness the difference between loss and removal. And that was the point. By the time the flames settled, there was nothing left to question on paper. No bodies recovered, no weapons found, no witnesses alive. Fire had done its work thoroughly, too thoroughly. When recovery teams finally pushed in days later, the ground gave them ash, warped metal, and silence. The engine was listed as destroyed beyond analysis. Personal effects were logged as unidentifiable. Convenient words. No one documented bullet damage. No one asked why fire patterns didn't match terrain. No one explained how 4 trained firefighters vanished without trace, while equipment markers remained. Those gaps weren't mistakes. They were allowances. Because fire doesn't write reports. People do. And people decide which questions make it into the record and which ones get buried under heat, time, and authority. The storm had done its part. Now the system would finish the job. By sunrise, the story was already fixed. 4 firefighters lost. Conditions extreme. Outcome unavoidable. Those phrases moved faster than any investigation ever could. They filled gaps before questions had time to form. They turned a crime scene into a tragedy and a decision into weather. Finnegan signed off without hesitation. No suspension, no inquiry, no pause. The mountain cooled. The smoke thinned. And the system that had stayed silent the night before became suddenly efficient. This was the point of no return, not because the men were gone, but because the lie was now official. Once a false record hardens, it stops being corrected. It gets defended. Anyone who challenged it would be accused of disrespect, of stirring pain, of misunderstanding fire. That's how execution becomes history. And that's how 4 men were erased twice, first by bullets and flame, then by ink and authority. What happened on Devil's Peak could no longer be undone, only uncovered. The official report was released 11 days later. It was clean, efficient, final. 4 firefighters lost during a fast-moving wildfire. Extreme winds. Unpredictable conditions. No remains recoverable due to heat intensity. A tragic sacrifice in service to the public. Every sentence reduced chaos to inevitability. No mention of armed men. No mention of rerouted calls. No mention of unanswered radios. The timeline skipped hours that mattered. Decisions were summarized instead of detailed. Names appeared only where praise was required, never where responsibility might land. The report didn't ask questions, it prevented them. Once published, it became the version everyone was expected to accept. Media outlets repeated it word for word. City officials echoed the language with solemn faces. A fire had taken 4 lives, they said. Not people, not choices, not silence, just fire. And with that framing, the case was declared closed, before the families had even learned what questions to ask. The funerals came next. 4 ceremonies, 4 flags folded with care, 4 coffins lowered into the ground, while cameras captured the right angles of grief. No one was allowed to open them. Officials explained it gently. Heat damage, safety concerns. Nothing left to identify. The words were rehearsed, delivered the same way each time. Families noticed the weight first. Pallbearers moved too easily. No strain in their shoulders. No hesitation in their steps. Coffins meant to hold men who worked with steel felt hollow. Mothers exchanged looks they didn't have language for yet. Wives held on to details that didn't fit. Brothers stared at the ground longer than prayer required. The honors were loud. Bagpipes, salutes, speeches about courage. But grief doesn't respond to ceremony. It responds to truth. And as the dirt covered the boxes, something settled that no official could address. They weren't burying remains. They were burying answers. The city spoke in unison. Banners went up. Streets paused. Headlines called them heroes before anyone could read past the first line. Officials praised bravery, sacrifice, duty. The words were heavy with approval and light on detail. At podiums, voices cracked on cue. In living rooms, silence settled in places no speech could reach. Families replayed the last conversations, the timing, the routes mentioned, the way some calls ended abruptly. They compared notes quietly, careful not to sound ungrateful. Gratitude was expected. Doubt was not. When one widow asked why no personal items were returned, the answer came quickly. Destroyed. When a brother asked for radio logs, he was told they were incomplete. Incomplete became a shield. Publicly, the story was polished and repeated until it felt permanent. Privately, grief turned sharp, edged with questions that refused to fade. Because praise, when used like this, doesn't honor the dead. It protects the version that can't be challenged. It started with small things. A watch that never came back. A jacket listed as unrecoverable, though its locker was found intact. A logbook mentioned once, then never again. Families asked politely at first. They were thanked for their patience, assured everything possible had been done. Then the tone shifted. Questions were met with delays. Requests were rerouted. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Grief, when it becomes persistent, is treated as inconvenience. One mother was told to stop chasing details. One wife was warned that reopening wounds helped no one. One brother was advised to respect the department. Respect, in this case, meant silence. But grief doesn't stay quiet when facts don't line up. It sharpens, it remembers. It notices when answers change depending on who's asking. By the time families compared notes openly, a shared realization had formed. They weren't being protected from pain. They were being protected from the truth. The department leaned harder into the story. Plaques were ordered. A memorial date was set. School children were taught the names before anyone outside the city could question how those names were lost. Hero status solved everything. Heroes don't get autopsies. Heroes don't get ballistics. Heroes don't get crime scenes. The designation shut doors that should have stayed open. Any request for further review was reframed as disrespect. Any doubt was treated as an attack on legacy. Behind closed doors, officials reassured one another the narrative would hold. Time would do the rest. Attention always moved on. But families noticed what the honor avoided. No timeline reconstruction, no independent review, no explanation for why procedures failed in sequence instead of randomly. Being called a hero is supposed to mean someone fought for you. Here it meant the opposite. The title didn't protect the men who died, it protected the people who signed the report. And the longer the praise echoed, the clearer the absence of proof became. Families requested records. Dispatch logs arrived with gaps. Radio transcripts arrived with timestamps missing. After-action notes arrived summarized instead of verbatim. When pressed, officials blamed heat damage, transcription limits, clerical loss. Different reasons, same result. A clerk quietly admitted something else. Several originals had been consolidated before release. That word did a lot of work. It meant fewer pages, fewer signatures, fewer hands to question. One father noticed a routing code on a dispatch sheet that didn't match the map provided at the funeral. When he asked for clarification, the follow-up meeting never happened. Another family was told the canyon data had been archived off-site. Requests stalled. Phones went unanswered. Paper existed. Access didn't. The system wasn't refusing outright. It was slowing everything until momentum died. Grief was expected to tire, but the inconsistencies didn't fade. They multiplied. And the more families compared notes, the clearer it became. This wasn't disorganization, it was containment. Behind closed doors, the families talked. Not loudly, not angrily, carefully. They compared dates, compared answers, compared the way officials avoided eye contact when certain questions came up. Each family had been told a slightly different version of the same story. That difference mattered. One widow remembered a late-night knock that never appeared in the report. One mother recalled a call time that shifted depending on who explained it. One brother realized the engine number cited publicly wasn't the one his sibling had driven. Individually, these were doubts. Together they formed a pattern. But speaking openly came with consequences. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. Friends from the department grew distant, careful with their words. Silence settled in, not from acceptance, but from pressure. The message was clear without being stated. Grieve quietly. Honor the story. Don't ask for more. Yet grief that's forced underground doesn't disappear. It waits. And it remembers exactly who told it to stay quiet. The first public doubt didn't come from a family. It came from a retiree, a former dispatcher long removed from promotions and pressure, mentioned something offhand at a community meeting. The timeline didn't match how fires like that were normally handled. Units weren't staged that way. Radios weren't left unanswered that long. The room went quiet. Families listened. Later, quietly, they found him, asked careful questions. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't need to. He just explained procedure and how this incident bent it in too many places at once. Word traveled slowly after that, not through headlines, through conversations, church steps, kitchen tables, late-night phone calls. The department responded fast. Statements were issued, clarifications followed, then reminders about respecting the fallen. But once doubt enters a story, it doesn't need volume. It needs consistency. And the official version was starting to change depending on who repeated it. That's when the families understood something important. The truth wasn't gone. It was unstable. The word martyr started appearing in print. It sounded respectful, noble, final. But martyrs choose something, they step forward knowing the cost. They aren't redirected, isolated, and silenced. Families bristled at the label. No one had asked if their sons or husbands had agreed to be symbols. No one had explained why help never came. No one addressed why records shifted after release. Martyrdom replaced accountability. Once the word took hold, questions became attacks. Anyone pushing back was framed as bitter, unable to accept loss, disruptive to healing. Healing apparently required obedience. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. A few families were encouraged to settle quietly. Scholarships were named. Foundations were proposed. Offers wrapped in goodwill arrived with one condition. Stop asking. Some accepted, some didn't. Those who didn't felt the shift immediately. Support faded, doors closed. The story had moved on, and anyone who refused to move with it was left standing alone, staring at a narrative that used honor to erase choice. The monument went up a year later. Stone, bronze, dates carved clean and permanent. Tour guides learned the script. Visitors were told about bravery, sacrifice, fate. The fire was blamed one last time, now in a form that couldn't be revised. Families stood at the unveiling and felt nothing close to peace, because monuments don't preserve truth. They preserve consensus. By then, the paperwork had aged enough to feel settled. The officials involved had moved on or up. The questions that once felt urgent were now labeled old wounds. The lie had matured. And like most lies backed by authority, it had grown heavier than the truth beneath it, harder to lift, harder to challenge without being crushed. 4 names were etched where answers should have been. The mountain had taken the men. The system had taken the story. And unless something disrupted that balance, it would stay that way forever. Honor standing guard over silence. Years passed, then decades. The canyon changed first. Blackened ground softened. New growth took hold where fire once ruled. Trails reopened. Signs were replaced. Visitors walked paths without knowing what had been burned into them before. The department changed too. New chiefs, new uniforms, new language for old systems. Names connected to Devil's Peak retired, promoted, or passed away without ever answering for that night. Families aged in different ways. Some stopped asking out loud. The cost was too high. Others held on to boxes of papers, notes scribbled in margins, records that never quite lined up. They learned which memories hurt less to revisit and which still cut. The case faded from conversation, then from newsprint, then from memory, at least publicly. That was the plan. Silence doesn't need enforcement forever. Time handles most of it on its own. It wears questions down. It turns suspicion into something people call obsession. But silence never erases facts. It just waits for the moment they resurface. While the questions faded, other things grew. Developments appeared near former burn zones. Land once deemed risky became valuable overnight. Permits moved quickly. Ownership shifted through shell companies that never seemed to linger long enough to be noticed. No one connected it publicly to Devil's Peak. Why would they? The fire had been ruled unavoidable. The loss sealed as fate. Any benefit drawn afterward was labeled coincidence. Inside city offices, familiar names circulated for decades. Men who'd signed reports went on to advise boards. Consultants with ties to old fire zones appeared in planning meetings. Nothing illegal on paper, nothing traceable without patience, and patience is expensive. Families noticed the changes but lacked leverage. Who listens to grief after 20 years, after 30, after 40? Time favors those who profit quietly. By the time younger generations asked why certain land parcels traced back to old disaster sites, the answer came ready-made. It's history. History in this case meant sealed files and people confident no one would ever bother reopening them. The silence had become useful, not just protective, but profitable. Time didn't heal the families. It organized their grief. Anniversaries became markers instead of memories. Every year the same questions returned, sharper because they had nowhere to go. Children grew up knowing their fathers through photos and controlled stories. Wives learned which names caused conversations to end. Parents aged fastest. Some passed without ever hearing an explanation that made sense. Others left instructions behind, boxes labeled, letters sealed, documents copied twice and hidden in different places. "Don't let them forget," one note read. For decades, requests were denied with softer language, records unavailable, files archived, personnel deceased, jurisdiction unclear, the reasons changed, the outcome didn't. Younger family members tried again in the 1980s, then the 90s, then the early 2000s. Each attempt met the same wall, now reinforced by time and indifference. What once felt urgent was now treated as nostalgia. But grief doesn't expire. It just outlives the people who caused it and waits for someone new to ask why 4 men never came home and why no one ever seemed angry enough about it. The canyon looked harmless now. Visitors picnicked where heat once pressed men to the ground. Trails were marked. Photos were taken. Children ran across soil that had swallowed ash and metal decades earlier. Nature had moved on. Paper had not. In storage rooms beneath municipal buildings, boxes sat untouched. Labels faded. Ink bled. Files referenced other files that no longer existed where they should have. Fire incident numbers skipped forward without explanation. Property assessments listed prior events without detail. Radio logs ended abruptly, then resumed hours later as if nothing had happened in between. No one reviewed them because no one was assigned to. Silence, once written into procedure, maintains itself. The truth wasn't destroyed. It was scattered, buried under routine, distance, and the assumption that anything this old couldn't possibly matter anymore. But old records have a weakness. They don't change. And one day when someone finally compared them without respect for rank or reputation, the gaps would stand out for what they were. Not age, absence. By the 4th decade, the silence wasn't passive anymore. It had rules. Requests for records required approvals that no longer existed. Departments redirected inquiries to offices that had been dissolved. Phone numbers led to voicemail boxes no one monitored. This wasn't resistance. It was design, hardened by time. Anyone asking about Devil's Peak was treated like a problem to be managed, not denied outright, delayed, redirected, worn down. The system learned that patience outlasts curiosity. Families noticed something else too. New hires knew nothing about the case, not because it wasn't relevant, but because it wasn't taught. Institutional memory had been edited. What remained was a shortened version that skipped danger and decision. The absence became normal. And once silence feels normal, breaking it sounds disruptive, suspicious, even disrespectful. That's how 50 years pass without answers. Not because the truth disappeared, but because an entire structure learned how to avoid it without ever saying the word no. The ground at Devil's Peak settled over time. Rain packed ash into soil. Roots grew through what heat had twisted. Rocks shifted just enough to hide what shouldn't have been there in the first place. Most people assumed everything had been destroyed because they were wrong. Metal survives fire better than memory. So do objects pushed deep enough to escape oxygen. Beneath the regrowth, fragments remained exactly where they'd been left, undisturbed not by secrecy but by neglect. No one searched because no one was told to. The incident had been closed before recovery ever truly began. The cost of reopening it was higher than the value assigned to truth. And so the mountain kept its silence. Hikers walked over it. Rangers marked it safe. Officials cited the case as resolved. But the land doesn't cooperate with narratives. It holds on to what's pressed into it. And all it takes is pressure in the opposite direction, a storm, a shift, a collapse for what was buried to resurface without permission. That moment was coming. Not because someone planned it, but because time eventually stops cooperating with lies. Silence feels solid until it isn't. For 50 years, Devil's Peak held steady. No major shifts. No reason to look twice. The past stayed buried because the ground cooperated. Then the weather changed. Storms grew stronger. Rain hit harder. Soil that had rested for decades began to slide in places no one monitored anymore. Maintenance budgets had moved elsewhere. Risk maps were outdated. Small collapses went unreported at first. Just erosion. Just nature doing what it does. Until something unnatural appeared. A shape where no shape should be. Metal where soil should have been uninterrupted. A line that didn't belong to the mountain. The silence that had protected the story didn't break because someone spoke. It broke because the land shifted. And when nature exposes what people hid, it does so without concern for reputation, rank, or time past. 50 years of quiet ended not with a confession, but with gravity. And once the mountain gave up its secret, the lie no longer had anywhere to hide. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came hard and uneven, soaking ground that hadn't been tested like this in decades. Trails closed. Warning signs went up late. Water cut paths through slopes that had held steady since the fire. On the 4th night, the hillside gave way, not all at once. Sections collapsed in stages, dumping soil and rock into a narrow ravine below Devil's Peak. Rangers arrived at first light, expecting erosion. What they found stopped them cold. Twisted metal pressed out from the mud at an angle that didn't match any known structure, too straight, too manufactured. Not debris from a recent storm. They cleared more earth by hand. Paint appeared beneath the dirt. Red, faded, municipal, an engine frame. Not where records said it should be, not broken the way fire damage usually left things, and not alone. Something else was wedged beneath it, sealed, cylindrical, deliberate. The mountain had shifted just enough to reveal what 50 years of paperwork had hidden. And with that shift, the case that had been closed for half a century cracked open without asking permission. The site was supposed to be empty. According to every official map, Engine 17 had been lost higher up the ridge, consumed completely, location unrecoverable. What sat half buried in the ravine contradicted all of it. Rangers marked the coordinates and double-checked them. Same result. The engine hadn't slid downhill, it had been left here, Fire damage told another story too. Heat scoring ran sideways, not upward. Some metal was warped, other parts were untouched. That doesn't happen when equipment is swallowed whole. They found impact marks along the frame, not from falling rock. Too clean, too focused. A supervisor ordered the area sealed. No photos released. No statements issued. The discovery was labeled pending review, a phrase meant to slow things down. But word had already moved. County officials were notified. Then state fire investigators. Then quietly, a cold case unit that hadn't been activated for years. Someone asked the question no one had asked in 5 decades. If this is where the engine ended up, where were the men? And for the first time since 1953, the mountain didn't have an answer prepared. Once the frame was confirmed, the phone calls changed. Local officials stopped returning messages. State offices took over communication. Instructions came down to preserve the site exactly as found. No heavy equipment, no cleanup, no press. That alone raised alarms. Cold cases don't usually move this fast, not without a reason. A forensic lead requested the original dispatch logs from 1953. The response came back incomplete, again. The same gaps, the same missing hours families had asked about for decades. This time, the explanation didn't land. Because the engine was real. The location was real. And the damage patterns didn't match the story that had been repeated for half a century. Someone inside the review team flagged the inconsistency and escalated it. Not quietly, in writing. That's when jurisdiction shifted again, away from departments tied to the original report. A sealed order authorized a full excavation. For the first time, the case wasn't being handled by the people who closed it. And that meant every old decision, every silent channel, every rerouted call was about to be examined by people with nothing to protect. Excavation began at dawn, not with machines, but with gloved hands and small tools. Every inch was logged, every scrape recorded. The goal wasn't speed, it was control. Within the first hour, they hit resistance, not rock, not root. A hollow sound followed the tap of steel. They cleared the soil carefully until the shape emerged, cylindrical, capped, sealed tight, not crushed, not burned, intact in a way fire doesn't allow. It wasn't part of the engine. It had been placed. The container was tagged and moved to a secure table. No one spoke while it was opened. Inside were remnants protected from heat, fabric fibers, paper fragments, and a strip of leather with an impression still visible. A nameplate. Scorched, but readable. The crew stopped work immediately, because this wasn't debris. It was evidence that had been preserved on purpose, and it meant someone had expected the fire to erase everything else. The container changed everything. Fire destroys paper. Heat warps leather. Time erases markings. Yet what they held in their hands had survived all three, which meant it had never been exposed. And the fibers inside showed no charring. The paper fragments weren't ash. They were preserved, folded, protected from oxygen. Someone had sealed them away before the flames reached this slope. That alone dismantled the original report, because the report claimed there was nothing left to recover. The nameplate confirmed it. One of the missing men. Unit designation still legible. Serial numbers partially intact. No firestorm leaves that behind by accident. Investigators documented the find in silence. No speculation. No commentary. Just measurements, photographs, timestamps. Because every step forward now pointed backward, toward decisions made in 1953. And whoever had placed that container believed no one would ever look here again. They were wrong. Once evidence survives a fire, the fire is no longer the story, the cover-up is. By midday, the site no longer felt like a recovery zone. It felt like a crime scene that had been ignored for half a century. Investigators laid the evidence out in sequence: engine frame, sealed container, nameplate, placement patterns that didn't align with collapse or drift. Every item asked the same question: who put this here? Because fires scatter. They don't organize, they don't seal objects away, they don't preserve identity. Someone had taken time. Someone had planned placement. Someone had decided what would be found and what wouldn't. That realization shifted the tone instantly. This wasn't about a natural disaster gone wrong. It was about human decisions made under pressure, followed by silence that held for decades. A supervisor finally said it out loud. If this was staged, then the report was written to support it. No one argued, because the ground had already contradicted the paper, and once physical evidence and official records disagree, only one of them can be lying. Reopening the file triggered resistance, not loud, not public, quiet friction in emails, delayed signatures, meetings that produced nothing but caution. The case had been cited for years as a closed tragedy. Training manuals referenced it. Memorial speeches leaned on it. Careers had been built around its finality. Undoing it meant consequences. Someone would have signed off on the false report. Someone would have ordered the site abandoned. Someone would have approved the burial of empty coffins. Those names were still on payrolls, or retirement lists, or donor plaques. A senior official suggested limiting the scope. Just confirm the location error. Issue a correction. Avoid interpretation. The request was denied. Because evidence doesn't care about legacy. Once the site was declared a homicide investigation, everything attached to the original narrative became fair game. Records, dispatch logs, internal memos that hadn't been touched in decades. The silence that had protected the story cracked again. This time not from the ground, but from inside the system that had sworn it was finished. Old files were pulled from storage. Boxes sealed with tape so dry it cracked when lifted. Pages yellowed, edges brittle, ink fading but still legible enough to read between the lines. That's where the pressure showed. Dates didn't line up. Times were rounded instead of logged. Dispatch entries jumped forward without explanation. One page referenced a call that didn't exist anywhere else. Another listed a supervisor who wasn't on duty that night. Corrections were handwritten, initialed by different people. Sometimes the same initials appeared on reports written months apart, in different handwriting. That doesn't happen by accident. A clerk flagged a margin note written in red pencil. Verified verbally. No name, no time, no source. Paper records don't change on their own. People change them. And once investigators started laying documents side by side, the story told in public began to fracture. Quietly, precisely, in ways that could no longer be dismissed as error. The lie wasn't loud, it was procedural. And that made it harder to defend. Patterns don't announce themselves, they repeat. As files were cross-checked, one signature surfaced again and again, not always in the same role, not always in the same department, but always present at key moments. Authorization forms, site clearance approvals, final review sign-offs. The name appeared where decisions were locked, not on the initial incident report, not on public-facing documents, on the internal ones, the pages that determined what moved forward and what stopped cold. At first, it looked like coincidence. Then they overlaid timelines. Every delay traced back to the same office, every redirection passed through the same hands, every verbal confirmation aligned with one chain of command. This wasn't a rogue act. It was continuity. Someone had stayed close to the case long enough to shape its ending, and far enough from the spotlight to avoid questions. The discovery didn't trigger celebration. It triggered restraint. Because once a name connects decisions across decades, the next step isn't speculation. It's confirmation. And that step would force the story into daylight. By the end of the week, the designation changed. What had been labeled a historical fire incident was reclassified, formally quietly, as a homicide investigation. That single word altered everything. Evidence protocols shifted. Chain of custody rules tightened. Agencies that had once shared oversight were removed from the process entirely. Subpoenas followed. Records that had never been requested were suddenly mandatory. Personnel files, transfer orders, retirement documents tied to the original command structure. The families were notified last, not with apologies, with facts. The engine had been found. Personal identifiers had survived. The original account could no longer stand. No promises were made, only a statement. The findings require a full review of all actions taken in 1953. For 50 years, the case had rested on the idea that nothing remained. Now the mountain had proven otherwise. And once a homicide file is reopened, it doesn't stop at what was buried. It goes looking for who made sure it stayed that way. Once the case was reclassified, the site changed overnight. Grids were laid across the slope. Soil layers were mapped by depth and composition. Every inch was documented before removal. This was no longer about recovery. It was about reconstruction. Forensic anthropologists took control. They worked slower than fire crews ever could. Brushes instead of shovels. Screens instead of buckets. Nothing moved without reason. Within hours, bone fragments surfaced, not scattered the way collapse would leave them, not crushed the way falling rock would explain. Positioned in ways that suggested placement, not chaos. Heat damage was present, but inconsistent. Some sections showed exposure, others were untouched, protected by soil that had been packed down deliberately. That mattered. Because extreme heat leaves signatures that can't be faked. And the signatures here told a story that didn't match the official record. One specialist marked the grid and said quietly, "These remains were not destroyed by fire." No one contradicted her. Because science doesn't bend to reports written decades earlier, and bones don't repeat lies. Fire changes bone in predictable ways. It fractures along known lines. It leaves discoloration patterns tied to temperature and duration. Those markers don't vary with time. They don't soften with age. The remains recovered at Devil's Peak showed something else. Several bones carried clean breaks, sharp, controlled, not caused by collapse or heat stress. Others showed entry points that didn't align with falling debris or equipment failure. One femur fragment stopped the review, a circular defect. Smooth edges, no splintering outward. That doesn't come from impact, that comes from velocity. The forensic lead documented it carefully, measuring diameter, angle, depth. She didn't speculate, she didn't need to. Because when bone carries that kind of damage, the source is limited. Fire doesn't punch holes, gravity doesn't either. Only force directed with intent leaves marks that precise. And once that conclusion entered the report, the story of an accident lost its final defense. Because damage like that can't be explained away. It has to be explained honestly. Once the defects were logged, analysts mapped angles. They reconstructed paths through bone using reference rods and digital overlays. Direction mattered, entry mattered, exit mattered more. The trajectories pointed inward. Not downward from collapse, not outward from blast force. Straight lines, consistent spacing, parallel orientation. That pattern narrowed the possibilities. Several fragments showed paired damage. Entry on one side, exit on the other. Heat had altered surfaces, but not enough to erase alignment. The spacing suggested controlled distance, not chaos. A firearms examiner reviewed the measurements and compared them against period ammunition. The diameters matched common service rounds from the early 1950s. No casing had survived. That was expected. What mattered was the bone. Bone preserves direction. It preserves force. It preserves truth long after sound fades. The examiner summarized it plainly. These injuries were caused by projectiles traveling at lethal speed. No embellishment, no theory, just a conclusion supported by physics. At that point, the investigation crossed a line it could never step back from, because accidental deaths don't leave firing patterns. Fire didn't cause the injuries, it followed them. That distinction mattered more than any report written in 1953. Several bone fragments showed thermal exposure layered over earlier trauma. Cracks from heat ran across surfaces that had already been fractured by force. Charring stopped short of damage that would have occurred if the injuries happened during the blaze. In simple terms, the men were hurt before the fire reached them. The order was wrong for an accident. Analysts documented the sequence with diagrams and timelines. Injury first, heat second, burial last. That sequence told a story without words. Someone had relied on the blaze to erase the order of events, to turn violence into loss, to let heat stand in for explanation. But heat can't reverse time. Once trauma occurs, the body records it permanently. Bone locks it in. The conclusion entered the case file without hesitation. The fire was not the cause of death. At that moment, the disaster narrative collapsed completely. What remained was intent. The next find wasn't bone, it was metal. A length of galvanized pipe surfaced several feet downslope from the remains. Not warped, not melted. Its threads were intact. The surface showed impact scoring along one side. This wasn't part of any fire engine inventory from the period. Equipment logs confirmed it. Station records ruled it out. The pipe had weight. Enough to control, enough to strike. Analysts photographed the markings and compared them against the fractures already documented. The alignment matched. Force patterns overlapped. The spacing fit the damage seen on skull fragments recovered earlier. Galvanized steel holds shape under heat better than most materials. It doesn't burn away. It waits, which made its presence undeniable. Someone had brought it there. Not for rescue, not for repair, for leverage. The pipe was logged as a potential weapon and sealed for lab testing. Fibers clung to its surface, protected by soil pressed tight around it decades earlier. The evidence didn't suggest panic. It suggested preparation. Lab results removed the last room for doubt. Microscopic analysis showed metal transfer on bone, trace elements consistent with galvanized steel. The marks weren't random. They followed repeatable strike angles, controlled force, multiple blows. This wasn't collapse trauma. This wasn't equipment failure. This was impact delivered by a human hand. Residue testing ruled out heat distortion as the source of fractures. Stress lines originated before exposure. That sequence was logged, verified, and signed by 3 independent specialists. No debate followed. Because science doesn't care about titles, uniforms, or time passed, it measures what remains and reports what happened. The findings were summarized in a single paragraph that changed everything. Cause of death: homicidal violence preceding fire exposure. That sentence carried more weight than 50 years of speeches, plaques, and official silence. Once it entered the record, the case stopped being historical. It became active, and everyone connected to the original account became part of the review, whether they were still alive to answer for it or not. Most people believe fire destroys everything. That belief protected the story for decades. In reality, intense heat often preserves evidence by sealing it away, cutting off oxygen, locking items in place, slowing decay. What burns on the surface can protect what's buried beneath. That misunderstanding mattered, because it explained why no one questioned the absence of remains in 1953. Officials leaned on the assumption that nothing could survive a blaze of that scale. The public accepted it. Families were told there was nothing left to recover. The science said otherwise. Bones endure heat differently than flesh. Metal outlasts flame. Soil insulates. Timing decides what's erased and what's recorded forever. The perpetrators counted on ignorance. They believed fire would stand in for explanation, that no one would look twice. That time would finish what heat started. Instead, time did the opposite. It preserved the evidence long enough for science to speak. And once science speaks, belief no longer matters. Up to this point, language had been cautious. Terms like inconsistent, anomalous, requires review. That ended here. The forensic panel met behind closed doors and issued a joint determination. Not advisory, not provisional. Final. Their conclusion stated plainly that the injuries could not be attributed to fire, terrain, equipment failure, or rescue conditions. Every alternative explanation had been tested and eliminated. What remained was intent. The report was signed by specialists with no ties to the original departments. Independent credentials. External oversight. No room for quiet influence. Once released, it triggered mandatory reporting requirements. The findings could no longer stay internal. They had to be forwarded to prosecutors. At that moment, the investigation crossed another threshold, because science had done its job. Now the question was no longer what happened. It was who decided it would never be told. And that question doesn't stay confined to labs. It moves straight toward accountability. One final inconsistency sealed it. Carbon analysis on bone fragments showed exposure patterns that didn't align with the reported burn window. The heat signatures placed injury hours earlier than the official fire timeline allowed. That meant the men were already dead before the blaze reached full intensity. This wasn't interpretation. It was chemistry. The numbers didn't bend. They didn't allow overlap. They removed coincidence entirely. Investigators compared this against dispatch records. The gap appeared immediately. A window of time where radio silence had been explained away as signal failure. It wasn't failure, it was absence. The men hadn't stopped responding because they were overwhelmed by fire. They had stopped because they were already gone. That realization forced a complete reconstruction of the night, minute by minute, decision by decision. Because once timing collapses, every explanation built on it falls too. And the story that had lasted 50 years finally ran out of room. By the time the final report was compiled, there was nothing left to argue. Bones had mapped force. Metal had confirmed contact. Timing had erased the accident theory entirely. Each discipline reached the same conclusion independently. Together they formed a chain no one could break without ignoring evidence outright. The body had done what witnesses never could. It spoke without fear, without loyalty, without regard for reputation. Every attempt to explain the deaths as unavoidable failed under examination. Every version of the original account collapsed once tested against physical reality. What remained was a simple truth recorded in formal language. These deaths resulted from deliberate human action. No adjectives, no emotion, no speculation, just fact. That sentence carried across agencies, into prosecutors' offices, into rooms where decisions had been delayed for decades. Science had finished its work. From here on, the case would no longer be about proof. It would be about responsibility. And responsibility doesn't age out. Once the cause of death was confirmed, investigators returned to the item that had started everything: the ledger. It was retrieved from evidence storage and re-examined under new authority. What once looked like a list now read like a transaction record. Names appeared beside dates, dates beside locations, locations tied directly to fire zones that later became development sites. The entries followed a pattern. Payments increased after each blaze. Not to firefighters, but to intermediaries, shell companies. Trusts formed weeks before incidents, dissolved months later. Margins carried notes written in shorthand, initials repeated. Some pages showed pressure marks, as if someone had written carefully, slowly, making sure nothing could be misread. This wasn't a diary, it was accounting, and accounting doesn't exist without intent. The ledger connected fires to money, money to land, land to influence, which meant the four men hadn't stumbled onto a secret. They had stepped into a system, and systems don't tolerate witnesses. Investigators traced the numbers line by line. Each payout corresponded to a fire labeled unpreventable. Each location was later rezoned. Each rezoning preceded a sale far below market value, followed by rapid redevelopment. The ledger didn't name buyers directly. It didn't need to. Bank transfers told the rest of the story. Funds moved through construction firms with no equipment, through consulting groups with no staff, through accounts opened and closed within the same calendar year. One pattern stood out. The same financial backstop appeared repeatedly, covering losses, smoothing risk, ensuring projects moved forward even when land shouldn't have been touched yet. That backstop had influence. Permits cleared faster. Inspections ended early. Complaints vanished. Fire made land cheap. The ledger showed who benefited. And once that connection was made, the four firefighters stopped being victims of chance. They became obstacles. Obstacles cost money. And money, when threatened, answers with force. As the ledger was decoded, the scope widened. This wasn't one fire, it wasn't two. Entries stretched across counties and years. Different zones, different crews. The same financial rhythm repeating again and again. Some fires failed to spread, payments dropped, others cleared entire ridgelines, payments doubled. The math told its own story. This was a business model, not a rash decision. Loss was calculated, risk was priced. Fire became a tool, not a consequence. One annotation stood out: short, deliberate. Crew unreliable. It appeared once. Next to it, a line drawn through a name. The following entry showed an unusually large payout tied to Devil's Peak. Investigators paused there because 4 men had worked that zone consistently. 4 men who knew response patterns. 4 men who would have noticed calls that didn't add up. The ledger didn't describe what happened to them. It didn't need to. The silence around their names said enough. Most of the names in the ledger led nowhere. Shell entities, deceased partners, firms dissolved decades earlier, paper ghosts with no pulse. One name was different. It appeared sparingly, never next to payments, always at transition points, land transfers, zoning approvals, final clearances after fires were declared closed. The handwriting changed when that name appeared. More deliberate. Pressed harder into the page. Records showed the same pattern outside the ledger. Property holdings consolidated under trusts. Political donations spread across parties. Public philanthropy that masked quiet accumulation. This person didn't need to handle money directly. They controlled direction. Investigators ran a simple check: alive or deceased, alive, elderly, wealthy, publicly respected, untouched by scandal, and still connected through foundations, boards, and advisory roles to the very agencies now reopening the case. That changed the pace immediately, because cold cases move slowly until they don't. And once a living name sits at the center of a 50-year lie, time stops being an excuse. It becomes a threat. The name didn't survive by luck. It survived by insulation. Decades of distance, layers of legal entities, advisors who specialized in keeping hands clean and questions redirected. Every connection ended just far enough away to avoid consequence. The ledger showed restraint where it mattered. This person didn't issue orders. They approved outcomes. They didn't plan fires. They benefited from them. That distinction had protected them for 50 years. Investigators traced correspondence tied to zoning boards and emergency funding approvals, always indirect, always through intermediaries, always plausible on paper. But patterns don't lie. Every time that name appeared near a decision, obstacles disappeared. Investigations stalled. Land moved quickly. Insurance disputes vanished. The firefighters had disrupted that rhythm. They noticed irregular calls. They questioned deployment timing. They kept notes. And once they decided to bypass local channels, the system responded. Not with panic, with correction. The ledger didn't record violence. It recorded aftermath, which meant the real decisions happened off the page. Investigators compared the ledger dates against personnel logs. That's where the alignment snapped into focus. The final entry before Devil's Peak was written less than 48 hours after the firefighters requested an external review. Not public, not documented in official channels. A quiet move meant to protect them. Someone knew anyway, which meant someone had access. The ledger didn't list the call, but the timing left no room for a coincidence. The request triggered action faster than any zoning approval ever had. That changed the framing. This wasn't retaliation after discovery, it was prevention. The system didn't wait to be exposed. It neutralized risk the moment it appeared. From that point forward, the investigation treated the ledger as motive, not background. Every name connected to that final entry was elevated from witness to subject, because when deaths follow an attempt to report wrongdoing, the line between corruption and homicide disappears, and the ledger wasn't just evidence anymore, it was a countdown. Devil's Peak stood out in the ledger for one reason: the payout. It was larger than any entry before it, larger than fires that destroyed more land, larger than zones that produced entire housing tracts. The numbers didn't match the damage, they matched the risk. Investigators overlaid the payout against internal notes recovered from archived planning files. One phrase appeared repeatedly in unrelated documents: delay unacceptable. That phrase showed up nowhere else. The fire had needed to do more than clear land. It had needed to erase a problem permanently. The ledger reflected that urgency. Funds were moved faster. Fewer intermediaries were used. The margin for error narrowed. Someone wanted certainty, and certainty costs more. That explained the scale of what followed. Not just the deaths, but the effort put into closing the case immediately after. Large payouts aren't rewards, they're insurance. And Devil's Peak was the most expensive policy on the page. Near the back of the ledger, a line had been written differently. No shorthand, no initials, no numbers attached. Just 4 names. They weren't crossed out, they weren't paid out. They were boxed in pencil, the pressure heavier than anywhere else on the page. Investigators compared the handwriting against other entries. Same hand, same pen, same timing as the final payout. The difference was intent. Every other entry tracked money. This one tracked people. The box wasn't emphasis, it was resolution. Next to it, a single word appeared, underlined once: resolved. No fire zone followed, no land transfer, no redevelopment note, because the outcome didn't need explanation. The ledger never described how the problem was handled. It recorded that it was. And once investigators saw that line, the argument ended. The deaths weren't collateral, they were the solution. By itself, the ledger was damning. Paired with the forensic findings, it was lethal. Investigators aligned the final ledger entry with the confirmed time of death. The overlap was exact, not approximate, exact. Money moved. Men died. Land changed hands. In that order. The argument that the fire came first collapsed entirely. The financial trail anticipated the deaths, accounted for them, and moved forward without pause. That sequence mattered, because accidents don't appear on balance sheets in advance. Tragedies don't come with contingency planning. Only intent does. Prosecutors reviewing the case flagged the convergence immediately. This wasn't circumstantial, it was structural. Each piece supported the other without strain. The ledger explained why. The bones explained how. The timeline explained when. Together, they explained everything. And once motive meets proof, the law doesn't ask for closure. It demands a name. The ledger was never meant to be poetic. It wasn't written to tell a story. It existed to make sure outcomes stayed predictable. And in that sense, it succeeded. Until it didn't. Every fire, every transfer, every payout followed the same logic. Remove resistance, reduce cost, move forward. People were variables, land was the objective. The 4 firefighters disrupted that equation. They asked questions that didn't belong in the margins. They noticed patterns that weren't supposed to be noticed. And once they chose to go outside the system answered. Not loudly, decisively. The ledger didn't record regret. It didn't record fear. It recorded completion. That's what made it so powerful. Because when a document tracks human lives with the same indifference as land parcels, it reveals the mindset behind the crime better than any confession ever could. By the time investigators closed the book, they didn't need speculation. They had motive in ink, and ink, unlike memory, doesn't soften with time. Silas Buck Henderson had survived longer than anyone else connected to the ledger. Not quietly, not in hiding. He lived openly, photographed, praised, celebrated. His name sat on buildings. His signature appeared on donation plaques. His presence at events signaled safety, not scrutiny. People described him as careful. Others called him generous. No one called him reckless. That reputation wasn't accidental. Henderson never stood near a fire line, never handled cash tied to damage, never signed a document that explained too much. His role existed above transactions, approvals without fingerprints. When officials needed funding, he appeared. When permits stalled, they moved again. When questions surfaced, they softened. He didn't instruct anyone to act. He made sure the right people felt supported when they did. Investigators reviewing his history noticed something consistent: proximity without ownership. He was always adjacent to decisions, never centered in them. Every benefit flowed toward him without a traceable path back. That kind of insulation doesn't form overnight. It's built through decades of patience, silence, and selective generosity. By the time the case reached his name, Henderson wasn't just wealthy, he was protected. And people who are protected long enough stop believing consequences exist at all. Henderson wasn't protected by fear. He was protected by usefulness. Every department had benefited from him at some point. Equipment donations, emergency funds approved without delays, projects that shouldn't have worked somehow moving forward. No one wrote those favors down. They didn't have to. When his name appeared near a decision, resistance faded. People convinced themselves they were being practical, cooperative, realistic. That's how immunity spreads, not through threats, but through comfort. Investigators reviewing decades of correspondence noticed a pattern. Whenever Henderson was copied on an email, discussions shortened. Concerns became footnotes. Final approvals arrived faster than usual. He didn't silence people. He made silence feel reasonable. And that made him dangerous because when everyone benefits a little, no one wants to be the first to ask questions. Accountability feels impolite. Scrutiny feels unnecessary. That's why no one challenged the original report. That's why the case stayed closed. That's why 4 deaths were accepted without proof. Henderson didn't need to erase evidence. He only needed people to look the other way. And for 50 years, they did. Once Henderson's name surfaced, investigators stopped circling. They went straight in. They cross-checked zoning approvals against his foundation's grant schedules. The overlap was immediate. Fires cleared land. Donations followed. Permits moved faster than policy allowed. It wasn't subtle. It was consistent. Phone logs showed brief calls before key decisions, never long enough to raise alarms. Calendar entries listed community meeting on days when zoning votes flipped without debate. Witnesses remembered him differently now, not as a donor, as a presence. He didn't argue, he didn't persuade. He reminded people who helped them when no one else would. That reminder carried weight. Investigators traced one final thread: financial backstopping tied to the Devil's Peak zone. The funds were routed cleanly, but the timing matched the ledger's largest payout exactly. That was the break, because it placed Henderson at the intersection of motive, money, and outcome. He wasn't adjacent anymore, he was central. And once that realization settled, the question stopped being if he'd be confronted. It became how long the system would hesitate before acting against one of its own benefactors. Henderson didn't see it coming. Men like him never do. The warrant wasn't dramatic. No flashing lights, no public spectacle. It was delivered quietly, the same way his influence had always worked, behind closed doors. That was intentional, because once the evidence was compiled, there was no advantage in noise. The case didn't need outrage. It needed precision. The charge wasn't framed as history, it was framed as homicide. The ledger, the payouts, the timing, the forensic findings. Each piece was laid out in a sequence that removed ambiguity entirely. Henderson's response was telling. No denial, no shock. Only a question about jurisdiction. That question answered everything. It showed he still believed process could save him. That familiarity with systems would bend the outcome the way it always had. This time, it didn't. Because systems protect power until proof removes their excuses. And once that happened, Henderson wasn't a benefactor anymore. He was a liability. A man who had lived untouched by consequence finally learned the limit of insulation. Not in a courtroom, but in the moment he realized the world had stopped looking away. The dead didn't testify, but they were the reason everyone was sweating. The courtroom filled early, not with curiosity, but with people who recognized each other from old paperwork and closed meetings. No one smiled. 4 names were read before opening statements. The family stayed still, others shifted. Some stared at the floor. This case wasn't about who showed up, it was about who never could. Bones, records, and money trails had carried the men here in their place. Evidence spoke where bodies could not. The judge didn't frame it as history. He framed it as accountability that had waited long enough. In that moment, everyone understood the risk. Time hadn't protected anyone, it had only delayed the reckoning. The prosecution didn't start with emotion. They started with sequence. Ledger entries, dispatch gaps, bone damage, timelines that locked together without strain. Each piece placed carefully, leaving no space to breathe. The room stayed quiet. Every claim matched a document. Every document matched physical proof. Nothing relied on memory, nothing depended on belief. That was the trap. Because the defense couldn't argue fire. Science had removed it. They couldn't argue accident. Timing destroyed it. They couldn't argue confusion. Money had moved first. The prosecutor paused only once, long enough for the weight to settle. Then came the sentence that froze the room. These men didn't die in a disaster. They were removed. No one wrote that down. They didn't need to. June Hale didn't look dramatic. That's why it worked. She spoke carefully, dates, notes, conversations she'd written down and never shared. Her role had been small. Her access hadn't. She described instructions that never went through radios. Meetings that weren't logged. A supervisor's order to stand down without explanation. No speculation, no anger. Just memory supported by paper. The defense didn't cross her hard. They couldn't, because she wasn't there to accuse anyone. She was there to explain why the truth had been delayed so long. When she finished, no one rushed to speak. The silence wasn't respect, it was recognition. The room understood something had shifted. This wasn't a theory anymore, it was testimony. The verdict didn't come fast. It came certain. Jurors didn't ask for clarification. They didn't revisit evidence. They returned with faces already set, hands steady as the foreperson stood. Guilty, not for negligence, not for failure, for homicide. The words settled heavier than any sentence that followed. Families didn't cheer. They closed their eyes. Some nodded as if confirming something they'd known for decades. The judge spoke briefly. He didn't lecture. He didn't dramatize. He acknowledged delay. Justice hadn't arrived late because it was hard. It arrived late because it was avoided. And when the gavel fell, the courtroom exhaled. Not in relief, but in acceptance. The truth had finally been said out loud. There was no applause after the verdict, no raised voices, no sense of victory. Justice arrived, but it didn't heal anything. The men who should have heard the word guilty never would. Their families sat with photographs instead of faces, years instead of answers. The sentence followed procedure. Dates, terms, conditions. None of it touched what had been taken. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked if this felt like closure. No one answered right away. Because closure suggests completion. This wasn't complete. It was acknowledgement. Delayed, restrained, and permanent. The truth had finally been recognized by the system that once rejected it. But recognition doesn't rewind time. It only changes what can no longer be denied. Henderson didn't leave the courtroom free, but he didn't leave whole either. Age had already taken what prison could not. Years had narrowed his world, slowed his body, thinned his circle. The sentence arrived after time had done most of its work. That didn't soften the outcome. It sharpened it. Because the delay wasn't mercy. It was strategy. And strategy had cost 4 lives and 50 years of silence. Some called it pointless to punish an old man. The families didn't. They called it necessary, not because it restored anything, but because it ended the lie that power outlives consequence. Henderson had built his life assuming time would protect him. It didn't. It only waited. The verdict didn't return lost years. It didn't undo empty birthdays, unanswered questions, or decades spent doubting reality. Justice corrected the record, but records don't raise children or sit at dinner tables. Families left the courthouse knowing something important had changed, even if nothing had been restored. The truth was no longer fragile. It couldn't be dismissed or rewritten again. That mattered, because lies survive when they are allowed to linger unchallenged. This one no longer could. Still, no one called the outcome fair. They called it accurate. And sometimes accuracy is the only thing justice can offer after waiting too long. The case closed quietly. No headlines lingered. No victory speeches followed. The system moved on the way it always does, forward without looking back for long. But the cost remained. 4 lives ended early. Families lived half a century without answers. And institutions learned how easy it was to delay truth until the damage felt distant. That lesson mattered most, because justice delayed doesn't disappear. It hardens. It waits for evidence strong enough to break resistance. This case proved something uncomfortable. The truth doesn't expire. It doesn't weaken. And it doesn't need permission to resurface. It only needs time. And time eventually stops protecting the wrong people. And the old plaque came down without ceremony, no speeches, no cameras. Just workers unbolting metal that had told the wrong story for 50 years. The replacement didn't use vague language. It didn't praise sacrifice without context. It named what had happened and why the truth took so long to surface. 4 names were carved clearly, not as symbols, as men. Visitors stopped longer than they used to. Some read the inscription twice, others stood in silence, processing what the place had never admitted before. This monument didn't celebrate heroism. It corrected the record, because remembrance means nothing if it's built on a lie. And once the lie was removed, the space finally did what it should have done all along. It told the truth. The monument wasn't built for officials. It wasn't for ceremonies or anniversaries or quiet apologies delivered too late. It was for the people who asked questions and were ignored. For families who were told to accept silence as explanation. For anyone who sensed something was wrong and kept that thought alive. The stone didn't honor power. It honored refusal to forget, refusal to accept convenience over truth, refusal to let time erase responsibility. That mattered, because cases like this don't survive on evidence alone. They survive because someone, somewhere, refuses to stop caring. The monument stood as proof of that. Not that justice always arrives on time, but that persistence eventually corners the truth. This case didn't end with relief. It ended with awareness. Awareness that systems don't fail loudly, they fail quietly, while people assume someone else is watching. Awareness that time protects those who know how to wait. And awareness that truth doesn't move on its own. It moves when pressure forces it forward. That's the part most people miss. These stories don't stay buried because they're unsolvable. They stay buried because silence is easier than confrontation, until it isn't. This case survived because someone reopened a door that was meant to stay shut, because records were questioned, because absence was treated as evidence, not closure, and because once the truth had enough space, it didn't hesitate. It stepped forward. Stories like this don't survive by accident. They disappear when evidence is destroyed, delayed, or buried by the very people meant to protect it. In this case, the absence of proof wasn't natural. It was engineered. A fire chief with authority helped seal records, control reports, and ensure nothing concrete survived long enough to challenge the official version. That's why this took 50 years. Not because people didn't care, but because the truth had no way to stand up in court. Until it did. If this case unsettled you, that reaction matters. If it made you angry, that matters more. Because justice doesn't fail when crimes happen. It fails when evidence is erased and power shields itself. Subscribe so you don't miss the next truth someone tried to erase. And if you still won't, comment why staying informed doesn't matter to you. Either way, choose awareness. Because ignorance is always cheaper than accountability.